When we speak of the empath, of the one whose soul carries the weight of invisible threads, we are not simply pointing to a personality feature, but to an entire way of being. It is a wound of the psyche that has been alchemized into sensitivity. To be an empath is to exist as if the skin between self and other had thinned to translucence, where one inhales not only one's own emotions, but also the tides of everyone nearby. And yet this very light that makes you magnetic also provokes discomfort in those who say they love you, but secretly bear a hidden resentment. For envy is not admiration nor mere desire. It is a corrosive shadow that looks upon radiance and longs to smother it. Few will ever confess, even to themselves, that their affection hides envy. Instead, it appears in small fractures, the shift in tone, the subtle withdrawal of warmth, the disguised remark that pierces like glass. Envy does not announce itself. It slithers. It cloaks itself in tenderness, so that its intention goes unseen. And so, many who draw near you may unconsciously seek to dim your glow, not out of hatred, but because your presence reminds them of what they lack, their own inability to feel as deeply, their fear of true closeness. The empath's gift is never a conscious decision. It is the fate of one whose inner defenses were breached early in life, through pain, rejection, or abandonment. A child who grows where love is scarce or conditional learns survival by tuning into every subtle vibration in others, for their safety depends upon it. They grow into adults who can feel the unspoken before it is even born, who anticipate, who soften, who absorb. And this survival mechanism, forged in suffering, becomes later mistaken for a luminous gift. But every gift carries its shadow. What begins as a survival strategy can, in adulthood, become a hidden prison. The empath learns to read others so clearly that they forget how to listen to their own voice. They can feel the storm rising in another's chest, but remain blind to the silent collapse within themselves. This is why so many empaths end up in relationships that drain them, because their compass is tuned not to their own needs, but to the unspoken needs of everyone else. And here lies the paradox. The very sensitivity that makes you luminous also makes you vulnerable to manipulation. Those who fear your light may not even intend to harm you, but unconsciously they will pull on your energy, demanding that you soothe their emptiness. They will seek to keep you small because your expansiveness terrifies them. They will test your boundaries, not out of strength, but because they sense you have not yet learned to defend them. Carl Jung once said that, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. For the empath, this truth is especially urgent. If you do not bring awareness to the hidden pattern, to the way you sacrifice yourself in order to keep the peace, you will find yourself repeating the same relationships again and again. Different faces, different names, but the same story of giving too much and receiving too little. The world does not always reward sensitivity. It often confuses it with weakness. Yet the empath is not weak. In fact, there is a hidden resilience in those who can endure the weight of emotions that are not even their own. But resilience without self-awareness becomes exhaustion. Strength without boundaries becomes servitude. And so, the journey of the empath is not only to feel but to discern, to ask what belongs to me and what belongs to the other, to learn that compassion does not mean self-erasure, to understand that love given endlessly, without balance, ceases to be love and becomes a slow form of self-destruction. Still, the empath's role in this world is sacred. For while others walk armored in indifference, it is the empath who dares to remain open, who dares to feel. They are the ones who sense the fractures in the human soul and pour presence into places where others only pour judgment. Their existence is proof that sensitivity, when claimed consciously, is not a curse but a form of quiet power. But to arrive at this power, One must pass through fire, the fire of disillusionment, the fire of betrayal, the fire of realizing that not everyone who smiles at you truly wishes you well. It is only by walking through this fire that the empath begins to see clearly that envy is not their fault, that rejection does not mean they are unworthy, that their sensitivity is not a wound to hide, but a force to embody. And when the empath begins to see this truth, the world around them also begins to shift. The veil that once kept them blind to patterns starts to thin. They notice the pauses in conversations that feel like silent accusations. They recognize the weight in someone's eyes that is less about admiration and more about longing, twisted into bitterness. What once felt like confusion now takes shape, and they begin to name what they feel. This is envy. This is projection. This is not mine to carry. The first step toward liberation is recognition. To call the shadow by its name is to weaken its grip. Jung insisted that what we resist persists, but what we face transforms. For the empath, facing means daring to look at the relationships that wound them, not with self-blame, but with clarity. It means asking, am I loved for who I am, or am I being tolerated only because I give what others cannot give themselves? This is not an easy confrontation. To stand before those you love and admit that their affection is laced with unconscious resentment is painful. It feels like betrayal, yet it is truth. And truth, though sharp, also sets free. The empath must learn that their role is not to heal every fracture, not to soothe every storm, but to discern which storms are theirs to face and which belong to someone else's inner weather. But awareness alone is not enough. Knowledge without action becomes another form of stagnation. The empath must translate this clarity into boundaries. Boundaries are not walls of cruelty, they are doors of protection. To say no is not to reject love, but to honor it. To say this is where I end and you begin is to affirm one's dignity. And dignity is the soil where authentic connection grows. Imagine the child who was never given this soil. Growing up, they stretch themselves thin, trying to anticipate the moods of a volatile parent or to absorb the silence of an absent caregiver. They learned that love was conditional, that safety depended on constant attunement to others. In adulthood, this child becomes the empath, gifted in perception, but starved of the ability to claim space for themselves. The old wound whispers, if I set boundaries, I will lose love. If I stop absorbing, I will be abandoned. And yet, the opposite is true. Without boundaries, love turns toxic. Without self-respect, intimacy collapses. It is only when the empath dares to risk losing false love that they open the door to real love. To risk saying, I will not carry what is not mine, is to allow the possibility of relationships where giving and receiving flow in balance, not in chains of dependency. Here lies the hidden lesson of pain. Suffering was never meant to make you a servant. It was meant to make you aware. The empath who survives betrayal does not emerge weaker, but sharper. They begin to recognize the disguises of envy, the masks of affection, the false tenderness that hides manipulation. They stop apologizing for their depth. They stop shrinking so others can feel tall. They begin to walk with the quiet authority of someone who knows, my sensitivity is not a curse, it is my compass, and I will not let you break it. And yet, every transformation has its tests. When the empath begins to stand tall, the world around them pushes back. Old friends may accuse them of arrogance. Partners may feel threatened by their newfound strength. Even family may resist, because the empath no longer plays the role that once kept everyone comfortable. This resistance is proof of growth. It is the echo of a system adjusting to the fact that you will no longer be its sacrifice. Jung warned that individuation, the process of becoming whole, is not welcomed by the crowd. To step into your wholeness is to step out of the roles others gave you. For the empath, individuation means refusing to be only the healer, only the listener, only the absorber. It means claiming the right to be messy, to be angry, to be imperfect. It means allowing yourself the fullness of humanity, not just the fragments that keep others safe. This is where the gift transforms. The empath who once drowned in other people's storms now becomes the calm eye within them. They still feel deeply, but they no longer confuse feeling with responsibility. They sense the emotions of others, but they no longer dissolve into them. They love, but they do not disappear. This is the true strength of the empath, not endless giving, but the ability to remain present without losing themselves. And something extraordinary happens here. When the empath embodies this balance, their presence becomes magnetic in a new way. Not because they are endlessly available, but because they radiate authenticity. People feel safe, not because the empath will rescue them, but because the empath's groundedness invites them to rescue themselves. This is the highest form of influence, to inspire others, not by carrying them, but by showing them what it looks like to carry oneself. The journey, however, is never linear. There will be relapses into old patterns, moments of self-doubt, times when the old wound whispers again. But each time the empath chooses boundaries, each time they choose truth over appeasement, the wound loses power. And in this repetition, the empath carves a new identity, not just the one who feels, but the one who knows, the one who chooses. This is the alchemy of the empath, pain transfigured into perception, perception sharpened into wisdom, and wisdom anchored in boundaries. What once was merely survival becomes artistry. What once was a curse becomes a compass. What once was the fracture of the child becomes the strength of the adult. And so, if you have lived your life sensing the emotions of others as if they were your own, if you have been wounded by envy disguised as love, if you have felt the exhaustion of carrying what was never yours, know this: you are not broken, you are not too much, you are not weak. You are on the edge of transformation. The shadows that sought to diminish you are the very shadows that reveal your light. Your sensitivity is not the end of your story, it is the beginning of your power. But the empath's awakening is not only about survival or self-preservation, it is about reclaiming something far greater, the right to exist without apology. For too long, the empath has lived in the echo of other people's voices, measuring their worth through someone else's approval, shrinking when their light provoked discomfort, bending when their boundaries threatened rejection. This cycle was not random. It was inherited, patterned, encoded into their nervous system like a silent script. When a child grows in an environment where love feels uncertain, they learn to survive by disappearing. Their attention becomes a radar scanning every sigh, every change in tone, every unspoken tension. They develop the ability to decode moods before words are spoken. What once was fear, will they leave me? Will they still love me? Becomes a superpower. And yet, this superpower comes at a cost. The child learns everyone else's language, but forgets their own. Adulthood does not erase this conditioning, it only masks it. The empath, now grown, enters relationships with the same radar always switched on. They know when their partner is troubled, before the partner knows. They anticipate needs before they are voiced. They soften their presence, silence their truth, sacrifice their peace, believing that harmony depends on their ability to disappear into the other. And for a time, this creates connection. But slowly, it creates chains. The chains are subtle. They do not rattle loudly. They whisper in quiet exhaustion, in the silent resentment that grows when giving is never met with receiving. They whisper when the empath realizes they are surrounded by people who take but rarely give, who praise their sensitivity but exploit it. These chains are forged not by malice, but by the empath's own belief that love must be earned through sacrifice. By the way, if you're curious to go even deeper and integrate your shadows and light, check out the Sim Method ebook. It's a concise guide that can help you unlock your inner power in just 5 minutes a day. The link is in the first pinned comment below. This belief must be shattered. For love is not earned by bleeding. Love is not proven by disappearing. Love that demands the death of your essence is not love. It is hunger dressed as affection. To awaken is to recognize this. To awaken is to see that the very thing you feared, rejection, is less dangerous than the slow erosion of your soul in the name of acceptance. Jung taught that wholeness comes not by rejecting the shadow, but by integrating it. For the empath, integration means embracing not only their light, but also their fire. It means admitting, yes, I feel deeply, but I also have edges. Yes, I can love fully, but I can also say no. Yes, I can see your pain, but I will not carry it for you. This balance is not cruelty, it is maturity. It is the boundary that allows love to breathe instead of suffocate. And something remarkable happens when the empath begins to live this way. The people who were drawn to their endless giving may drift away, unable to tolerate the new balance. This feels like loss, but it is purification, for in their place others arrive, those who do not fear depth, who do not exploit sensitivity, who do not resent light. These new connections are not built on need, but on mutual recognition. They are not chains, but mirrors. Yet, this shift requires courage. To let go of old patterns is to walk into uncertainty. The empath must stand in moments of silence where once they would have filled the air with care. They must endure the discomfort of being misunderstood, of being called selfish for the first time, of being accused of coldness by those who only valued them when they were endlessly warm. This is the price of transformation. To claim one's wholeness, one must be willing to be misjudged by those still trapped in half-truths. But within this discomfort lies liberation. For the first time, the empath breathes without holding someone else's air. For the first time, they feel anger not as shame, but as a compass pointing to what matters. For the first time, they speak a truth that trembles in their chest and discover that the world does not collapse when they do not please everyone. This is the rebirth. This is the moment the empath realizes. My light was never meant to be hidden. My voice was never meant to be silent. My presence was never meant to be diminished. And here, the empath's gift reveals its ultimate purpose. It was never only about feeling others. It was about remembering what it means to feel oneself fully. It was about breaking the illusion that love is earned by erasure. It was about standing so firmly in authenticity that even the shadows of envy cannot extinguish the flame. Those who envy you will still exist. They will still project their fear onto your presence, still disguise their discomfort in small cuts of language. But you will no longer bleed from them. You will no longer confuse their shadow with your truth. You will see envy for what it is, a confession of poverty, not a judgment of your worth. You will see resentment, not as your failure, but as another's mirror of their own unclaimed soul, and you will walk forward, unburdened, luminous, not because you are untouched by pain, but because you have learned to alchemize it. For the empath, destiny is not to remain a wound. Destiny is to become the healer of oneself first, and then, by presence alone, to invite others into their own healing. The world does not need empaths who burn out in sacrifice. It needs empaths who burn bright in authenticity. It needs those who can stand in the storm without losing their center, those who can feel deeply without drowning, those who can love without erasing themselves. And you, if you recognize yourself in these words, must know this path is yours. You are not here to carry everyone. You are here to embody what carrying yourself looks like. You are here to turn the wound into wisdom, the sensitivity into strength, the survival into sovereignty. This is not the end of the empath's story. It is the beginning of their power. Yet power for the empath is not the kind that the world often recognizes. It is not loud, not domineering, not the kind that commands armies or bends crowds. It is quieter, subtler, like the strength of a flame that refuses to be extinguished by the wind. True power, for the empath, is the ability to remain themselves in a world that constantly asks them to be someone else. But how do you hold this flame steady when life itself seems designed to test it? You will notice that the moment you begin to reclaim yourself, life sends trials to measure the depth of your choice. Old relationships may resurface, tempting you back into familiar patterns. The voice of guilt will whisper, "You are abandoning them, you are cruel, you are ungrateful." The world will not applaud your boundaries. At first, it will resist them. This is why so many empaths relapse into the old roles. Because the discomfort of freedom feels, at times, heavier than the prison of sacrifice. Yet every time you choose to hold your ground, something shifts inside. The voice of guilt grows weaker, the chains of obligation loosen, and little by little, the empath begins to feel something they have rarely tasted before: sovereignty. Not the sovereignty of ruling over others, but of ruling over oneself. The sovereignty of knowing, "I belong to me. My energy is not a commodity to be spent recklessly. My love is not an endless well for those who only come to drink without ever giving back." Jung spoke often of individuation, the process by which a human becomes whole, becomes themselves, not a copy of others, not a mask worn for approval. For the empath, individuation is both the challenge and the gift. The challenge because so much of their identity has been defined by others. The gift because once they reclaim their wholeness, their light shines not only for themselves, but for everyone who dares to see. The empath who has walked through betrayal and envy begins to see patterns everywhere. They notice how society itself often exploits sensitivity, rewarding hardness and dismissing gentleness. They see how workplaces value productivity over presence, how relationships often value convenience over authenticity. They see how the world conditions people to numb rather than feel. And in this awareness they realize, my sensitivity is not an error in the system. It is a rebellion against it. To feel deeply in a world that numbs is an act of defiance. To remain open in a world that closes is a form of strength, and yet this defiance must be tempered with wisdom. Otherwise, the empath risks once again becoming the martyr, the one who absorbs the pain of society itself. This is why integration is essential. The empath must learn to discern when their gift is being honored and when it is being exploited. They must learn that compassion without discernment is self-destruction. Consider how many empaths are drawn to partners who appear broken, who seem to need saving. At first this feels like love, a noble mission to heal, but soon it becomes a cage, because the empath's worth is tied to fixing what was never theirs to fix. This is not love, it is codependency disguised as devotion. The awakening empath learns to resist this pattern. They learn that true love is not about rescue, but about recognition, not about one absorbing the other's wounds, but about both standing whole, side by side. The path of the empath, then, is the path of returning home. Home to themselves, home to their truth, home to the forgotten voice that was silenced in childhood. This homecoming is not a one-time event. It is a daily choice, a discipline, a practice of saying, I matter too. My needs are valid. My boundaries are sacred. Each time this is affirmed, the empath reclaims a piece of their soul that was lost to the hunger of others. And the more they reclaim, the more luminous they become. Not luminous in the fragile way of someone who glows only when praised, but luminous in the steady way of a star that shines even when unseen. This luminosity cannot be taken by envy, cannot be dimmed by resentment, cannot be stolen by manipulation. It is not dependent on the approval of others, because it flows from within. Here lies the paradox. When the empath finally stops giving themselves away, their presence becomes even more healing. Not because they are sacrificing, but because they are whole. Wholeness radiates, wholeness inspires, wholeness shows others that it is possible to live without masks, without erasure, without fear. And in this way, the empath fulfills their true role, not the savior of others, but the example of what it means to be real. Still, let us not romanticize this journey. It is hard. It is lonely at times. There are nights when the empath lies awake, wondering if the price of boundaries is worth the silence it brings. There are days when the temptation to shrink again feels overwhelming. Growth is not a straight path. It spirals, it loops, it tests, but every step forward leaves a mark. And these marks, though invisible to the world, are proof of transformation. One day, the empath will look back and see how far they have come. They will remember the times they were drained, the times they were diminished, the times they mistook chains for love. And they will marvel at the strength it took to leave. They will marvel at the courage it took to stand. And they will know, in the marrow of their being, that their sensitivity was never the weakness others made it out to be. It was the fire that carried them here. And perhaps, just perhaps, they will finally understand. The wound was not the end of the story. It was the doorway. But every doorway opens into a new landscape. And for the empath, this landscape is both liberating and frightening. Freedom feels wide, vast, uncharted, and the first instinct, after years of being confined in the narrow corridors of others' expectations, is to doubt it. Am I allowed to live this way? Can I truly exist without shrinking? These questions echo in the mind of the awakening empath, not because they lack strength, but because they have been conditioned to believe that strength meant silence and love meant sacrifice. It takes time for the nervous system to adjust to freedom. The body, long accustomed to tension, flinches even when no danger is present. The heart, once trained to race at every sign of disapproval, still stutters when someone pulls away. This is why healing is not only mental, it is cellular. The empath must teach their body that safety no longer depends on constant vigilance, that peace no longer requires self-erasure. Each boundary spoken, each truth expressed, becomes not just an act of courage, but also a reprogramming of the soul's memory. And here lies a deeper truth. The empath's journey is not merely personal, it is archetypal. Jung would remind us that what feels individual is often collective, that in every empath's struggle lives a universal story. The empath is the wounded child, the healer, the visionary, the bridge between worlds. Their suffering mirrors the ancient myth of those who descended into shadow to bring back light. Their rebirth is the echo of countless souls who, across time, learned that sensitivity is not a curse, but a key. This key, however, only opens doors when the empath dares to use it consciously. Otherwise, it remains a chain disguised as a gift. Conscious sensitivity means choice. It means no longer feeling by compulsion, but by presence. It means no longer absorbing unconsciously, but discerning intentionally. Without this shift, the empath remains trapped in endless cycles of depletion. With it, they step into mastery, not mastery over others, but over their own inner compass. And mastery is magnetic. Something happens when an empath stands in their sovereignty. Others feel it. They may not understand it, but they sense the difference. Where before the empath's energy leaked outward like an open vessel, now it flows with intention. Their presence no longer says, "I will save you," but instead, "I will see you if you are willing to see yourself." This subtle shift changes everything. It filters out those who seek to exploit and draws in those ready for real connection. But this new gravity also brings new responsibility. The empath must now choose what kind of world they will build with their gift. Will they retreat entirely, protecting their sensitivity by isolation? Or will they step into the arena, risking exposure, offering their presence to a world that often resists it? There is no single path. For some, the calling is solitude, the quiet work of creativity, reflection, inner depth. For others, the calling is to guide, to teach, to heal. What matters is that the choice is conscious, not coerced. Yet even in solitude, the empath's work continues. To live authentically is itself an act of teaching. To embody wholeness is itself a mirror that changes those who witness it. The empath does not need to preach or persuade. Their very being becomes a message. This is what it looks like to survive the fire and not be consumed. Of course, the fire never truly disappears. Life will continue to test, to provoke, to stir. Old patterns may resurface like ghosts asking to be noticed, but the empath who has walked this path will know a ghost cannot harm you if you no longer fear it. The past may knock, but it cannot dictate. The wound may whisper, but it no longer commands. This is the difference between living as a victim of sensitivity and living as its master. And so the empath becomes paradox embodied, soft yet strong, open yet guarded, giving yet discerning. They learn that true intimacy is not about dissolving into another, but about standing fully as oneself while welcoming another who does the same. They learn that love is not found in losing oneself, but in sharing oneself whole. This is the great reversal. What began as a wound becomes wisdom. What began as survival becomes sovereignty. The empath who once begged for scraps of affection now radiates with the quiet assurance that they are enough. The empath who once feared rejection now chooses solitude over betrayal. The empath who once saw their depth as a burden now sees it as a crown. And perhaps this is what makes them dangerous, not in cruelty but in clarity. For the world often thrives on masks, on superficiality, on transactions disguised as love. An empath who sees through these illusions cannot easily be controlled. They are no longer swayed by flattery, no longer broken by envy, no longer trapped by guilt. They become untouchable, not because they are hard, but because they are whole. And wholeness in a fractured world is the rarest form of rebellion. But rebellion, for the empath, is not about raising fists against the world. It is quieter, subtler, and far more enduring. It is the rebellion of refusing to betray oneself any longer, to stand in a room where others expect compliance and instead offer truth, to face the pull of guilt and still choose integrity, to risk being misunderstood rather than live as a ghost of someone else's desires. This rebellion is not dramatic, it is steady, and it is sacred. When an empath reaches this stage, something shifts not only within them, but also in how the world responds. People begin to sense an unfamiliar energy, where once the empath bent under the weight of others' moods, now they carry themselves upright, unshaken. Their eyes no longer plead, they witness. Their voice no longer trembles, it resonates. And those who once thrived on their softness find themselves unsettled because the old scripts no longer work. There will be accusations. You've changed. You're cold. You don't care anymore. These words are not reflections of truth, but of disorientation. Those who were used to feeding on the empath's endless giving now face a mirror that reveals their own hunger. They mistake the empath's boundaries for cruelty because they have confused exploitation with love. This misunderstanding is painful, but it is also confirmation. The empath has grown beyond the old cycle. And here lies one of the deepest lessons. True growth is always misinterpreted by those who remain in patterns you have outgrown. Jung called this individuation, the process of stepping into your unique self, no longer bound by collective expectations. Individuation is not a path toward comfort, but toward authenticity. and authenticity often makes others uncomfortable. Yet this discomfort is the price of freedom. The empath who accepts it discovers a new kind of peace, not the fragile peace of constant appeasement, but the steady peace of inner alignment. No longer pulled in 1,000 directions, they begin to hear their own voice with clarity. For perhaps the greatest tragedy of the empath is not that others misunderstood them, but that they themselves forgot how to listen within. Now, in the quiet after the storm, that voice returns. At first it is faint, fragile, hesitant. It asks simple questions. What do I want? What do I need? Questions that once felt dangerous now feel revolutionary. For the empath, to desire is to reclaim humanity. To need is to reclaim dignity. To answer these questions honestly is to rewrite the story that once demanded their silence. Slowly, they begin to act on these answers. They say no without apology. They choose rest without guilt. They seek joy not as a reward for sacrifice, but as a natural right. These choices may seem small, but they are tectonic shifts in the empath's world. Each one chips away at the lie that love must be earned through suffering. Each one builds the foundation of a new identity, not the eternal giver, but the sovereign soul. And from this foundation, something extraordinary emerges. The empath who once saw their sensitivity as weakness now sees it as vision. They notice subtleties others overlook, not because they are drowning in them, but because they are attuned. They perceive connections, patterns, undercurrents. They become not only feelers, but seers. And this sight, sharpened by pain and tempered by boundaries, becomes a source of wisdom. This wisdom is not theoretical. It lives in the body, in the memory of scars, in the knowledge of what it costs to betray oneself. The empath carries it not as doctrine, but as presence. When they walk into a room, others feel it. The resonance of someone who has walked through fire and come out whole. This presence cannot be faked, cannot be taught. It can only be forged in the crucible of lived experience. And so the empath becomes both teacher and mirror, whether they intend to or not. Their life speaks louder than their words. They no longer need to convince anyone of their worth because their very being embodies it. They no longer need to heal everyone they meet because their authenticity invites others to heal themselves. They no longer seek approval because they are rooted in their own truth. This is the culmination of the empath's journey, to turn the wound into wisdom, the sacrifice into sovereignty, the sensitivity into strength. To live not as the shadow of others' needs, but as the full expression of their own soul. To show the world that depth is not weakness, that openness is not fragility, that feeling is not a curse, but a form of power. Yet, even here, the path does not end. For the empath, growth is lifelong. The shadows may return in new forms, the old wounds may whisper again, but now the empath meets them not with fear, but with recognition. They know the difference between what belongs to them and what does not. They know how to walk through darkness without losing their flame, and this knowing is freedom. Freedom not from pain, for pain is part of being human, but freedom from chains, from illusions, from the endless cycle of giving without receiving. Freedom to love without losing oneself, to feel without drowning, to shine without apology. And in this freedom, the empath discovers their true destiny, not to be the savior of everyone, not to be the sacrifice of anyone, but to be the living proof that sensitivity can survive in a hard world, and not just survive, but thrive. But thriving does not mean the absence of struggle. It means the ability to dance with it without being consumed. For the empath, thriving begins when they no longer fear their own depth, when they realize that the intensity of their emotions is not a storm to suppress, but an ocean to navigate. The waves may rise, the tides may pull, but they are no longer drowning. They are steering. This shift transforms everything. Where once sensitivity felt like a burden, it now feels like an anchor of authenticity. The empath no longer asks, "Why do I feel so much?" Instead, they ask, "What does this feeling reveal?" Pain becomes information, joy becomes direction, anger becomes boundary, sadness becomes truth. Each emotion is no longer an intruder, but a messenger. And in listening, the empath discovers that their inner world is not chaos, but guidance. It is here that the empath begins to see the distinction between empathy and fusion. Empathy is the ability to understand and feel with others. Fusion is the loss of self in the process. The empath's journey is to reclaim empathy without falling into fusion, to remain open without dissolving. This balance is delicate, but once achieved, it grants them a strength few possess, the ability to connect deeply without losing themselves in the connection. And such depth terrifies those who live on the surface. Because true intimacy requires more than masks. It requires the courage to be seen fully, shadows and all. Many are not ready for this, and so they project, they resent, they withdraw. But those who are ready, those rare souls who can meet the empath in equal depth, become companions of extraordinary resonance. Together, they create bonds that are not chains, but symphonies. Yet these bonds are rare, and the empath must learn patience. Loneliness may visit, but loneliness is not always the enemy. Sometimes it is the teacher. In solitude, the empath learns to distinguish between the hunger for connection and the readiness for it. They learn that being alone is not the same as being abandoned. They learn that their own presence can be enough. And from this place of fullness, the connections they later form are no longer born of desperation, but of abundance. This abundance is magnetic. It shifts how the empath moves through the world. They no longer chase validation because they already carry their own worth. They no longer fear rejection because they no longer reject themselves. They no longer shrink because they no longer confuse dimness with safety. They shine, not for attention, but because shining is their nature. And in shining, they inevitably provoke envy. But this time, they see it differently. They no longer internalize it as proof of their unworthiness. They recognize envy as the shadow of admiration twisted by fear. They understand that envy says more about the other than about them. And so they no longer collapse under it. They stand, they witness, they move forward. Jung would call this integration, the ability to hold light and shadow without being devoured by either. For the empath, integration is the crowning moment of their journey. They no longer disown their sensitivity, nor do they allow it to control them. They no longer reject their wounds, nor do they let them define them. They hold it all, the wound and the wisdom, the light and the shadow, the strength and the tenderness, and in holding it, they become whole. Wholeness is rare in this world. Most live fragmented, chasing approval, fleeing their shadows, wearing masks that suffocate their essence. The empath who reaches wholeness becomes a living reminder that another way is possible. They do not need to speak loudly. Their presence alone disrupts illusions. Their authenticity exposes falsehood. Their calm unsettles chaos. This is their quiet revolution. But revolutions, even quiet ones, demand perseverance. The empath will still encounter those who misunderstand, who diminish, who resent. Yet now these encounters no longer define them. They are challenges, yes, but not prisons. They are mirrors, but not verdicts. The empath sees them for what they are, tests of alignment, opportunities to reaffirm truth. And so the empath keeps walking, not as the wounded child they once were, but as the sovereign soul they have become. They carry scars, yes, but these scars are not shackles. They are stories of survival, maps of where they have been, proof that they can endure. They carry light, yes, but this light is not naive. It has seen darkness and still it shines. This is the paradox of the empath's destiny. They were broken to become unbreakable, wounded to become healers, silenced to find their voice. Their gift was born in pain, but their power is forged in choice, and each day they choose again, not to be consumed, not to be erased, not to be diminished, but to live fully, to feel deeply, to love wisely. And perhaps, when history remembers them, it will not be for their suffering, but for their transformation. For the way they turned poison into medicine, shadows into guides, sensitivity into strength. For the way they proved that to feel is not to fall, but to rise differently. In the end, perhaps the greatest secret is this: your sensitivity was never a flaw to hide, but the very compass that points you back to yourself. The world may try to tame it, diminish it, or twist it into weakness, but only you can decide what it means. To be an empath is not to carry the weight of everyone's shadows, it is to walk through your own and emerge luminous. And maybe that is why life gave you this gift, not to lose yourself in others, but to remind them, through your wholeness, that depth still exists, that truth still matters, and that in a world addicted to masks, the bravest act is to be real.